Madonna Santissima. I'll never forget the morning of June 28, 1943, when I watched American cooks throw away enough bread to feed my entire village in Abruzzo for a week, only to discover later that this was just the daily surplus from feeding 50,000 prisoners, better than most Europeans had eaten in peacetime. The Alabama sun was beating down on the wooden barracks at Camp Aliceville, the smell of fresh bacon mixed with the scent of magnolia blossoms, and Bing Crosby's That's Amore was playing from a radio in the mess hall, a cruel irony for an Italian prisoner who was witnessing abundance that seemed impossible in a world at war. I was Sergeant First Class Giuseppe Nonna Benedetti, 132nd Armored Division Ariete, Italian Army, and after 18 months of fighting in the deserts of North Africa, where we survived on stale bread and ersatz coffee, I thought I understood everything about military logistics, about wartime rationing, about the sacrifices that nations made to feed their armies. My nickname, Nonna, came from my ability to stretch meager rations into decent meals, using skills my grandmother had taught me during the lean years after the Great War. But what I witnessed over the next 2 months in that Alabama prison camp would challenge everything I believed about American society, about the true scale of industrial warfare, and about what it meant for a nation to possess abundance so vast that feeding 50,000 enemy prisoners was considered a routine logistical operation. Those American cooks would teach me that what appeared to be waste was actually evidence of systematic plenty, that apparent inefficiency masked unprecedented efficiency, and that we weren't just fighting American soldiers, we were fighting American agriculture, American transportation, and American industrial capacity operating on a scale that European minds could barely comprehend. My journey to that revelation began on May 13, 1943, when the last organized Axis resistance collapsed in Tunisia, and I found myself among thousands of Italian and German prisoners being processed for transport to camps in the United States. We'd been fighting a losing battle for months, watching our supplies dwindle while Allied materiel seemed to increase exponentially. The contrast became apparent immediately during our capture processing. While we Italian prisoners received basic medical care and adequate rations according to Geneva Convention requirements, I couldn't help but notice that American soldiers were eating food that would have been considered luxurious by Italian standards. Real meat at every meal, fresh vegetables, white bread, coffee with sugar and cream. "Look at how these Americans eat," I whispered to my friend Antonio Rossi, a tank driver from Milano who'd been captured in the same engagement. "They're getting fatter while we're at war. No wonder they're winning, they're not making any sacrifices." This observation seemed confirmed during our Atlantic crossing aboard a converted cargo ship. The American crew ate meals that included fresh fruit, multiple meat courses, desserts, and unlimited coffee, while we prisoners received adequate but simple rations that were still better than what we'd eaten during the final months of the North African campaign. "These Americans don't understand war," observed Marco Fierro, a mechanic from Torino who'd served in Africa since 1940. "Real soldiers eat whatever they can find and are grateful for it. These people eat like they're on vacation." Our criticism of American eating habits reflected broader Italian assumptions about the relationship between military effectiveness and personal sacrifice. We believed that soldiers needed to suffer to be properly motivated, that nations needed to make painful sacrifices to deserve victory, that abundance indicated weakness rather than strength. When we arrived at Camp Aliceville on June 15, 1943, my first impression was of a facility that seemed more like a resort than a prison camp. The barracks were wooden but well constructed, with proper roofs, windows, and heating systems. The grounds were maintained like a military base, with paved roads, recreational facilities, and even gardens where prisoners could grow vegetables. But it was the mess hall that first demonstrated the scale of American abundance in ways that challenged my understanding of wartime logistics. The building could seat 800 prisoners at once, with serving lines that could process thousands of meals efficiently, and kitchen facilities that seemed designed for feeding a small city rather than a prison camp. "Madonna," whispered Franco Di Marco, a sergeant from Napoli, as we entered the mess hall for our first meal. "This kitchen is larger than the entire mess facility for our regiment in Africa." He was right. The American mess hall at Aliceville was equipped with industrial-sized ovens, refrigeration units, mixing equipment, and storage facilities that exceeded anything I'd seen in military service. But more shocking than the size of the operation was the apparent waste that seemed to characterize every aspect of American food service. That first meal included roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, dinner rolls, butter, coffee, and apple pie for dessert. The portions were enormous by Italian standards. Enough food for 2 meals served as a single dinner, and when I tried to save half my portion for later, American guards told me it wasn't necessary. "Don't worry about saving food, paisano," said Sergeant Williams, a friendly guard from Georgia who spoke broken Italian. "We got plenty more where that came from. Eat as much as you want. There's always more in the kitchen." This attitude toward food was incomprehensible to someone who'd grown up in rural Italy during the economically difficult 1920s and 1930s, then served in an army that had struggled with supply shortages throughout the African campaign. Food was precious, not abundant. Meals were rationed carefully, not served without limits. But over the following days, I began to observe American food service practices that seemed to confirm my suspicions about wasteful abundance. Every morning I watched kitchen staff discard bread that was 1 day old, pour out milk that was approaching its expiration date, and throw away vegetables that weren't perfectly fresh. "These Americans throw away more food in 1 day than my family ate in a week," I complained to Antonio during our second week at the camp. "They have no respect for what God provides, no understanding of how precious food really is." My indignation increased as I volunteered to work in the mess hall and observed American food handling practices firsthand. Kitchen staff would prepare extra food just in case, then discard whatever wasn't consumed rather than saving it for the next meal. Portions were standardized at levels that ensured everyone ate adequately, but this meant constant surpluses that seemed criminally wasteful. "Sergeant Benedetti," said Staff Sergeant Bobby McKenzie, the mess hall supervisor, "when I questioned these practices, I know this seems like a lot of waste to you, but we got orders to feed every prisoner according to American Army standards. That means fresh food, adequate portions, and proper nutrition, whatever it costs." His explanation revealed the philosophical difference between American and European approaches to military logistics. Americans were willing to accept what appeared to be waste to ensure that no prisoner went hungry, while European military culture accepted hunger as inevitable and rationed scarce resources accordingly. But my understanding of American food abundance began to change when I learned about the true scale of the prisoner of war system that Camp Aliceville represented. During a conversation with Captain Robert Morrison, the camp's administrative officer, I discovered that our facility was just one of over 650 POW camps operating across the United States. "Camp Aliceville houses about 6,000 prisoners," Captain Morrison explained during one of our weekly meetings, "but nationwide we're feeding approximately 425,000 German and Italian POWs, plus thousands of Japanese prisoners on the West Coast." The numbers were staggering: 425,000 enemy prisoners receiving 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, according to American Army standards that exceeded the nutritional levels available to many American civilians during the Depression. "Captain," I asked, "how is it possible to feed so many prisoners while also feeding your military forces and civilian population? Where does all this food come from?" His answer opened my eyes to the scale of American agricultural production and the efficiency of American food distribution systems that made such abundance possible even during wartime. "Sergeant Benedetti," he said, "American farms produce more food than Americans can consume, even with millions of people in military service. Feeding POWs actually helps prevent food from spoiling in storage facilities while ensuring that enemy soldiers are treated according to international law." This explanation challenged my basic assumptions about the relationship between abundance and waste. What I'd interpreted as careless disposal of precious food was actually evidence of systematic overproduction designed to ensure that no one went hungry, regardless of their status as citizen, soldier, or enemy prisoner. But the full scope of American food abundance became clear when I was assigned to work in the camp's supply depot and began to observe the logistics system that supported daily operations at Camp Aliceville. Every morning, supply trucks arrived loaded with fresh meat, vegetables, dairy products, and baked goods. The quantities were enormous: hundreds of pounds of beef and pork, crates of fresh eggs, gallons of milk, sacks of flour and sugar, cases of canned fruits and vegetables. "Giuseppe," said Corporal Danny O'Sullivan, the supply sergeant who managed these deliveries, "you look amazed every time the food trucks arrive. What's so surprising about getting supplies for the mess hall? Corporal, I replied. In Italy, we would consider this a month's supply of food for an entire regiment. You receive this much food every day for one prison camp. His response revealed the casual attitude toward abundance that characterized American military culture and reflected the underlying economic reality that made such abundance possible. Giuseppe, this is just standard military rations multiplied by the number of prisoners we house. Nothing special or extraordinary, just basic logistics for feeding 6,000 people according to Army regulations. But there was nothing basic about logistics that could deliver fresh food daily to remote locations, maintain cold storage facilities in Alabama heat, and coordinate meal service for thousands of people with military precision. This represented systematic efficiency, operating on a scale that European military logistics had never attempted. My perspective began to shift when I learned that Camp Aliceville was receiving food from suppliers located hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Beef came from ranches in Texas and Kansas, vegetables from farms in California and Florida, dairy products from Wisconsin and Minnesota, and canned goods from processing plants scattered across the entire continent. How is this possible during wartime? I asked Corporal O'Sullivan. How can food travel such distances while transportation is needed for military supplies? His explanation revealed the depth of American infrastructure and the scale of American production that made such logistics routine rather than extraordinary. Giuseppe, America has enough transportation capacity to handle military logistics, civilian needs, and prisoner operations simultaneously. We don't have to choose between feeding soldiers and feeding prisoners. We can do both because our production systems are large enough to handle all requirements. This abundance was made possible by agricultural productivity that exceeded anything in European experience. American farms were mechanized on a scale that allowed small numbers of farmers to produce enormous quantities of food, while American transportation systems could move that food efficiently across continental distances. But the revelation that transformed my understanding came when I discovered the true purpose of what I'd been interpreting as wasteful food practices. During a conversation with Sergeant Williams, I learned that apparent waste was actually evidence of quality control standards designed to ensure prisoner health and nutrition. Giuseppe, he explained, we throw away day-old bread, not because we don't value food, but because regulations require fresh food for prisoner meals. We discard milk near its expiration date because spoiled milk could make prisoners sick. We replace vegetables that aren't perfectly fresh because nutrition standards require quality ingredients. These standards reflected systematic attention to prisoner welfare that went far beyond Geneva Convention requirements. Americans weren't wasting food from carelessness or abundance. They were maintaining quality standards that ensured enemy prisoners received nutrition superior to what many of them had eaten as free citizens. But where does all this discarded food go? I asked. Surely it's not simply thrown away. The answer revealed another aspect of American systematic efficiency that I hadn't understood. Food that was unsuitable for prisoner consumption was redirected to other uses. Day-old bread went to local livestock farms. Near-expiration dairy products were processed into animal feed, and imperfect vegetables were used for fertilizer or composting. Nothing gets wasted, Giuseppe, Sergeant Williams assured me. It just gets used for different purposes. Food that's not good enough for human consumption can still be valuable for other uses. This system of reuse and recycling reflected American approaches to resource management that maximized efficiency while maintaining quality standards. What appeared to be waste was actually evidence of systematic planning that found productive uses for every available resource. My education in American abundance continued when I was assigned to help with inventory management and learned about the scale of stockpiling that supported Camp Aliceville operations. The storage facilities contained enough food to feed 6,000 prisoners for months without any additional deliveries. Why do you store so much food? I asked Captain Morrison. Surely fresh deliveries make such stockpiling unnecessary. His answer revealed strategic thinking about logistics and supply chain management that reflected American approaches to military planning and risk management. Sergeant Benedetti, we maintain large inventories to ensure continuous operations, even if supply deliveries are interrupted by weather, transportation problems, or enemy action. Stockpiling represents insurance against uncertainty, not evidence of wasteful abundance. This systematic approach to logistics reflected American military culture that emphasized preparation, redundancy, and margin for error in all operational planning. Rather than operating with minimal resources and accepting risk, Americans preferred to maintain surplus capacity that could handle unexpected challenges. But the most profound revelation came when I learned about the broader context of American POW operations and their relationship to overall American war production. During a meeting with camp administrators, I discovered that feeding 425,000 prisoners represented less than 1% of total American food production. "Captain," I asked, "if feeding nearly 500,000 prisoners requires only a small fraction of American production, what does this suggest about total American agricultural capacity?" Captain Morrison's response provided insight into American economic capabilities that explained not just abundance in prisoner camps, but American ability to supply military forces worldwide while maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded European peacetime levels. "Giuseppe, American farms produce enough food to feed the entire population, plus military personnel, plus allies, plus prisoners, with significant surplus remaining. Our agricultural productivity allows us to be generous with enemy prisoners, because such generosity costs us almost nothing in relative terms. This abundance was made possible by systematic advantages in mechanization, fertilization, transportation, and processing that allowed American agriculture to operate at efficiency levels that European farmers couldn't match. But beyond efficiency, American farming benefited from natural advantages in climate, soil, and land availability that provided enormous productive capacity. The scale of this abundance became apparent when I learned that Americans were simultaneously supplying food to British and Soviet allies, maintaining domestic consumption levels that exceeded pre-war standards, and feeding military forces on multiple continents, while still having surplus capacity for feeding enemy prisoners, according to generous standards. "We're not just fighting American soldiers," I told Antonio Rossi during one of our evening discussions. "We're fighting American farms, American trucks, American factories, American railroads, an entire economic system operating on a scale that European nations can't match." This recognition helped explain American military successes that had puzzled Italian observers throughout the war. American forces weren't just better equipped than Axis forces, they were supported by production and distribution systems that could maintain supply levels regardless of distance from home bases or duration of operations. But understanding American abundance also created complex emotions about Italian participation in the war and the choices our government had made in allying with Germany against such overwhelming economic power. "Giuseppe," asked Franco De Marco, "if America has this much food just for prisoners, what does this suggest about Italian chances for military victory?" It was a question that forced me to confront the mathematical impossibility of Italian success against an enemy that could treat feeding hundreds of thousands of prisoners as a routine logistical operation. Italy was fighting not just American military forces, but American industrial capacity, agricultural productivity, and economic abundance that exceeded Axis capabilities by factors that made victory inconceivable. My final education in American systematic efficiency came when I learned about food distribution networks that supplied not just POW camps, but civilian populations, military bases, and ally nations simultaneously. The same transportation systems, storage facilities, and processing plants that fed prisoners were part of integrated networks that handled all American food requirements with systematic efficiency. This isn't just abundance, I realized. This is systematic organization of abundance on a scale that European nations have never attempted. The difference between American and European approaches to resource management was fundamental. Europeans rationed scarce resources carefully, accepting shortages as inevitable, and distributing limited supplies according to priority systems. Americans produced surplus resources systematically, then managed distribution to ensure that everyone's needs were met, regardless of their status or circumstances. This systematic abundance explained not just American military capabilities, but American confidence in ultimate victory. Nations that could afford to feed enemy prisoners better than those prisoners had eaten at home possessed economic advantages that made military defeat of such nations virtually impossible. When I was transferred to agricultural work details outside Camp Aliceville, my education in American abundance continued through direct observation of farming operations that demonstrated productivity levels incomprehensible by European standards. Single American farms produced more food than entire Italian districts, using mechanization and techniques that allowed small numbers of workers to cultivate enormous areas efficiently. American livestock operations raised more cattle than existed in entire European provinces, while American grain production exceeded the total agricultural output of some European nations. Madonna Santissima, I whispered to Antonio as we watched American farming equipment harvesting crops that stretched to the horizon. One American farm produces more food than my entire region in Abruzzo. This agricultural abundance was supported by infrastructure, roads, railroads, storage facilities, processing plants that allowed food to be moved efficiently from farms to consumers across continental distances. American food distribution represented systematic efficiency operating on a scale that European logistics had never approached. But perhaps most importantly, American abundance was taken for granted by American citizens and soldiers who'd never experienced the scarcity that shaped European attitudes toward food and resources. Americans expected adequate nutrition as a basic right, not as a privilege to be rationed carefully according to social priority. This expectation of abundance created different approaches to military logistics, civilian morale, and international relations that gave Americans systematic advantages over enemies who were accustomed to operating under conditions of scarcity. My understanding of American abundance was completed when I learned that similar systematic efficiency characterized all aspects of American war production, not just food, but manufactured goods, raw materials, transportation, and energy production, operating at scales that exceeded combined Axis capabilities. "We're fighting an entire continental economy," I told Captain Morrison during one of our final conversations before repatriation. "Italy and Germany combined cannot match American production in any category of war materiel." His response was both generous and devastating, acknowledging Italian military competence while explaining why such competence had proven insufficient against American systematic advantages. "Giuseppe, Italian soldiers are brave and skillful fighters who deserve respect from any professional military officer. But individual courage and tactical excellence cannot overcome systematic disadvantages in production, logistics, and resource availability that determine the outcome of industrial warfare between modern nations." This analysis helped me understand not just American victory, but the broader transformation of warfare from contests between individual soldiers to competitions between industrial systems. Modern wars were won by nations that could produce, transport, and supply military forces more efficiently than their enemies, regardless of individual soldier quality or tactical doctrine. When I was repatriated to Italy in August 1945, I carried with me not just memories of American abundance, but understanding of systematic approaches to organization and resource management that could benefit Italian post-war reconstruction. "The Americans didn't defeat us through superior individual soldiers," I explained to other returning veterans. "They defeated us through superior organization, better farming, better transportation, better production, better distribution of everything needed for modern warfare." This recognition influenced my post-war career as I worked to help rebuild Italian agriculture and industry using systematic approaches I'd observed during my American captivity. Italy needed not just to restore pre-war production levels, but to adopt American methods that could achieve efficiency and abundance that exceeded traditional European capabilities. "We can learn from American abundance without copying American culture," I told other Italian veterans who were skeptical of American methods. "Their techniques for organization and efficiency can serve Italian purposes while preserving Italian values and traditions." This philosophy guided my work in agricultural development as I helped introduce mechanization, improved distribution, and systematic planning that increased Italian food production while maintaining traditional approaches to farming that preserved Italian rural culture. The friendship I developed with American camp personnel continued through correspondence that provided ongoing insights into American society and opportunities for Italian-American cooperation in agricultural development and food distribution. "Giuseppe," wrote Sergeant Williams in 1950, I'm glad to hear that you're using American farming techniques to help rebuild Italian agriculture. The abundance that impressed you at Camp Aliceville came from systematic approaches to production and distribution that any nation can adapt to its own circumstances. Similar correspondence with other American veterans provided information, equipment, and technical assistance that helped accelerate Italian agricultural recovery while building lasting relationships between former enemies who'd become friends and collaborators. In 1955, I was invited to visit the United States as part of an agricultural exchange program, and my return to Alabama provided opportunities to see how American abundance had continued to expand during peacetime prosperity. "Giuseppe," said Captain Morrison, now a successful farmer in Georgia, "American agriculture has become even more efficient since the war ended. We're producing more food with fewer workers, using better equipment, and improved techniques that could benefit agricultural development anywhere in the world." During that 1955 visit, I toured American farms, processing facilities, and distribution centers that demonstrated continued innovation in systematic organization and resource management. American abundance hadn't been just a wartime achievement. It was a permanent characteristic of American economic systems that continued to expand and improve. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that American abundance wasn't just about having more food or resources. It was about creating systems that could provide security and opportunity for everyone, including former enemies who demonstrated willingness to learn and cooperate. "The food we served to POWs during the war," Captain Morrison explained, "wasn't waste or extravagance. It was investment in future peace and friendship between nations that had been enemies." This investment had proven successful. Italian prisoners who'd experienced American abundance became advocates for Italian-American cooperation, using their knowledge of American methods to help rebuild Italian agriculture while building lasting relationships that benefited both nations. My correspondence with American friends continued until my death in 1987, providing 44 years of friendship that began with misunderstanding about American waste and grew into appreciation for American systematic abundance and its potential for building lasting peace between former enemies. "You know what I learned at Camp Aliceville?" I wrote to Sergeant Williams in my final letter in 1986. "That apparent waste was actually evidence of systematic efficiency, that abundance could be a tool for building friendship rather than a sign of weakness, and that former enemies could become lifelong friends when they understood each other's true character and capabilities." This was my story, Sergeant First Class Giuseppe Nonna Benedetti, who learned that American waste was actually evidence of abundance so vast that feeding 50,000 enemy prisoners was routine rather than extraordinary, that systematic efficiency could create security for everyone, and that former enemies could become friends when they recognized each other's strengths and contributions. My experience at Camp Aliceville taught me that abundance was not about having more than you needed, but about creating systems that ensured everyone had enough, that American strength came not from individual superiority, but from systematic organization that maximized everyone's potential, and that the most powerful weapons against hatred were generosity and understanding. What struck you most about my discovery of the true scale of American food abundance? Have you heard similar stories from family members who experienced American logistics during wartime? These personal testimonies help us understand how individual experiences can reshape entire nations' relationships and create foundations for lasting peace. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Feldwebel Hans Müller, a German supply sergeant who discovered that American logistics capabilities extended far beyond food to every aspect of military operations. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.